My husband said he was flying to the Maldives with the woman he truly loved, leaving me stranded in a snowy cabin with barely 2 weeks of supplies and no phone, insisting I'd manage on my own. As his car disappeared down the winding mountain road, I simply smiled. He had no clue what awaited him at the airport. "You'll survive. You always do. That's your problem," Forrest had said, like my ability to endure made me disposable, like resilience was weakness instead of strength. I lay in my grandmother's cabin 2 days after emergency surgery, watching through a frost-clouded window as Forrest threw his suitcase into my Jeep. His mistress, 26, toned, glowing with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, was already in the passenger seat. They were heading to the Maldives. 7 days overwater bungalow, $42,000 of our joint savings funding their romantic escape. Meanwhile, I was trapped here. No phone, no transportation, no way to call for help if complications set in. The surgeon had been explicit. I was vulnerable. I needed constant monitoring, infection, hemorrhaging. A dozen things could go wrong. Forrest knew that. He'd been there when the doctor explained it, phone in hand, barely listening. He'd smiled then. The same smile he wore now as he climbed into the driver's seat. He rolled down the window, leaned out. "Oh, and Brooke, I changed the locks on the apartment this morning. Just so you know, wouldn't want you wasting energy trying to get in when you finally make it back to civilization." He laughed. Actually laughed. I stood at the window, one hand pressed against the surgical incision, the other braced against the wall for support. Every breath was agony, every heartbeat a reminder I should be in a hospital, not abandoned in the mountains. But I wasn't crying, wasn't collapsing, wasn't breaking the way Forrest expected. I was smiling because he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He thought he'd planned everything, thought he'd accounted for every variable, thought I'd be too weak, too isolated, too broken to fight back. He'd forgotten one thing. He'd forgotten who I was. And that oversight was going to cost him everything. The Jeep's taillights disappeared around the bend where the pine trees grew thick enough to block the sky. I watched until there was nothing left but tire tracks in the snow and the faint smell of exhaust hanging in the cold mountain air. My legs were shaking. The walk from the bed to the window, maybe 15 foot, had taken everything I had. The incision pulled with each breath, a reminder that my body had been opened, gutted, fundamentally altered just 48 hours ago. Emergency hysterectomy, that's what the surgeon had called it. When I'd woken up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, Forrest was nowhere to be seen. I'd been hemorrhaging at home. Massive blood loss, the kind where minutes matter. Forrest had driven me to the ER with his jaw clenched tight, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was angry at it, at me, at the inconvenience of my medical emergency, interrupting whatever he'd been doing that afternoon. The surgeon had been a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. She'd explained everything while Forrest stood in the corner of my hospital room, scrolling his phone with the focus of someone reading something far more important than his wife's medical crisis. I'd watched her eyes flick from him to me, watched her mouth tighten, almost imperceptibly. Recognition. The universal signal women give each other when they see what's really happening beneath the surface. "Complete bed rest for 2 weeks, minimum," she'd said, directing her words at me, but watching Forrest. "No stairs, no lifting anything heavier than a water bottle. You'll need constant monitoring for fever, excessive bleeding, signs of infection. You'll be extremely vulnerable during recovery." That word, vulnerable. Forrest had looked up from his phone then and smiled. I should have known right then what he was planning. Should have recognized that smile for what it was. Not relief that I'd survived, but calculation, opportunity. But I'd been too drugged, too exhausted, too focused on the searing pain across my abdomen to think clearly. Now, standing at the cabin window, watching the space where my Jeep had been, I understood everything. This morning, Forrest had brought me breakfast, lukewarm oatmeal that tasted like paste, and my pain medication. I'd watched him move around the room with careful efficiency, like he was checking items off a mental list. Then he'd done something that made my stomach drop. He'd picked up my phone from the nightstand and slipped it into his pocket. The movement was so smooth, so practiced I'd almost missed it. "You need complete rest," he'd said, smiling that smile. "Doctor's orders. No work stress, no social media rabbit holes. I'm doing you a favor, Brooke." I'd wanted to argue, but the pain had been too sharp, the medication making my thoughts slow and sticky. I'd watched him leave the room, heard him moving through the cabin, heard the scrape of firewood being stacked. the clank of cans being organized in the pantry. He'd been preparing, planning, making sure I had just enough to survive, but not enough to escape. Then he'd come back to the bedroom and delivered his announcement like he was reporting a business trip. "I'm flying to the Maldives." "But Natalie, you remember Natalie? My personal trainer. Natalie?" Of course it was Natalie. I'd met her twice. Once when I'd picked Forrest up from the gym 6 months ago. She'd barely glanced at me, just kept talking to Forrest about core engagement and optimizing his routine. The second time was at a fundraiser 3 months back. She'd look through me like I was furniture. 26 years old, all toned muscle and high ponytails and Instagram posts about wellness journeys and living your best life. And now she was in my Jeep heading to the Maldives with my husband, funded by my money. "I'm taking the joint savings," Forrest had said, words tumbling out faster like he wanted to get it all out before I could interrupt. "All 42,000, already transferred this morning while I was sleeping. Turns out Natalie and I don't need a down payment on a bigger house. We need a vacation. We need to remember what it feels like to be young and happy." He'd pulled our apartment keys from his jacket pocket, the keys on the Tiffany keyring I'd given him on our wedding day, and dropped them on the floor. The sound they'd made was small but final, like bones breaking. "Change the locks too. Your stuff's in storage. Public storage on Route 38, Unit 519. Paid for 1 month. After that, they auction it off. So, you might want to prioritize picking it up when you get back to civilization." I tried to stand, made it halfway before the pain folded me back onto the bed. I'd pressed both hands against the incision, feeling heat, inflammation, or rage. Impossible to distinguish. "Why?" I whispered. Forrest had actually considered the question, tilting his head like I was a mildly interesting puzzle. "Because you're 39 and you let yourself go. Because Natalie makes me feel alive in a way you haven't in years." He'd straightened, adjusting his leather jacket, the one I'd bought him for our 8th anniversary. "Because the opportunity presented itself. Your surgery, this isolated cabin, perfect timing, and I'm smart enough to take it." That's when he'd said it. That line about me being a survivor, like it was my fatal flaw instead of my strength. Now I stood at the window, watching the empty space where my life used to be, and let myself remember what Forrest had conveniently forgotten. This cabin wasn't a prison. It was my grandmother's legacy. Graham had left it to me 3 years ago when she passed. It had been her refuge after my grandfather died, a place where she'd rebuilt herself, learned who she was without a man defining her, created a life on her own terms. She taught me everything during the summers I'd spent here as a kid: how to split wood, how to read weather patterns in the clouds, how to start a fire with damp kindling, how to be alone without being lonely. "You're stronger than you know, Brooke," she told me during my last visit before she died. We'd been sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains. Life's going to test that strength someday. When it does, remember where you come from. Remember what I taught you. At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental. Graham was 83, reflecting on her life, passing down wisdom the way grandmothers do. But now I understood. She'd been preparing me, warning me. She'd met Forrest exactly once at our wedding. I'd watched her watch him throughout the ceremony, her expression unreadable. During the reception, she'd pulled me aside. "Trust your instincts, Brooke," she'd whispered, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "Always." I'd laughed it off, too happy and in love to hear what she was really saying. But Graham had known. Somehow she'd seen what I couldn't, that the man I was marrying had the capacity for this kind of cruelty. I forced myself to move away from the window, each step a negotiation with pain. The bedroom was small, sparse, exactly as Graham had left it. Handmade quilt on the bed, simple dresser, a wooden chair by the window where she used to sit and read, and on the wall, barely visible in the weak morning light, a framed cross-stitch she'd made years ago. A woman who knows her worth doesn't measure herself by a man's opinion. I stared at it, feeling something shift in my chest. Not just pain, something harder, more solid. Forrest thought he'd destroyed me. Thought he'd left me broken and helpless and alone. He was wrong. I made my way to the kitchen, every step deliberate, every breath measured. It took 5 minutes to cross the main room. 5 minutes of agony and determination, but I made it. And there, mounted on the wall next to the ancient refrigerator, exactly where my brother Garrett had installed it 3 years ago, was the satellite phone. I lifted the receiver, heard the dial tone, clear and beautiful as a promise. Forrest had made his calculations, planned his escape, accounted for every variable, except one. He'd underestimated me, and that mistake was going to cost him everything.